Good evening, everyone. And hello to all the newcomers who are here for the first time. Good to have you here. So this is Manju Jaidka bringing you the 22nd edition of Mellow Musings. Most of you are already familiar with Mellow and with our musings, but for the uninitiated, I'll be happy to repeat. And those of you who are already familiar with the facts may sit back and just bear with me. What is Mellow? Mellow is a society that we formed way back in 1997, and we've had 27 conferences so far, which is not a bad record, really, is it? And we've had a number of other activities. We have a huge platform, an international presence, and we're very happy with whatever we are doing. This year in January, we started Mellow Musings, online sessions every fortnight as far as possible. And this is the 22nd. This is December, and we hope to complete at least 24 this year. We'll talk about it before we wind up. Today, we are going to talk about something that all of us are interested in, and that is Virginia Woolf. We have an August panel out here who will be discussing various aspects of Mrs. Dalloway. So today we have a date with Mrs. Dalloway, who is 100 years young, 100 years young, and many more miles to go. You know, after you cross 50 or let's say 60, you should actually start counting backward. So in that case, Mrs. Dalloway is almost a teenager, I guess. Okay, so let me give you a brief introduction to Virginia Woolf. And I'm doing it because this session is being recorded and it will be uploaded on YouTube. And there'll be many people looking at it who are not so familiar with Mrs. Dalloway or with Virginia Woolf. And for their sake, a little bit of background to Virginia Woolf and Mrs. Dalloway. When I think of Virginia Woolf, I'm always reminded of a quotation that we were very familiar with when we were students. Life is not a series of gig lamps symmetrically arranged. Life is a luminous halo, a semi-transparent envelope surrounding us from the beginning of consciousness to the end. How many times we repeated it in all our classes, in all our papers, in all the term papers that we used to write. So Virginia Woolf, when we think about her, at least when I think about her, I think of a writer who dared to listen to the quiet stirrings of the inner life. She was born in 1882, grew up in a world that often dismissed women's creative ambitions. Well, the world still is dismissive of that, but she persisted. Virginia Woolf persisted, forming with her peers the Bloomsbury Group, where artists and thinkers nurtured one another's courage to experiment and to feel deeply. Virginia Woolf's true gift was her ability to capture the texture of consciousness, that flicker of memory, that sudden shift in mood, the small invisible motions of the mind that shape who we are. She wrote not merely with intellect, but with sensitivity and compassion. In A Room of One's Own, that all of us are familiar with, she reminded us that women writers need space, literal and figurative, to create. That truth still resonates with us. Virginia Woolf's life, as we probably know, was marked by personal struggle, and it gave her extraordinary insight into the fragility, the resilience, and the ache of being human. When we read Virginia Woolf, we feel that we are in the company of someone who understands the quiet battles that we fight within ourselves. She is different from other writers who preceded her. She is unconventional. There's a quotation from her. She says, It is 1,000 times better to have the courage of one's own peculiarities than to be crushed by the weight of convention. We remember her today for the stream of consciousness technique that runs through her novels. As she writes, I quote again, the past only comes back when the present runs so smoothly that it is like the sliding surface of a deep river. This fluidity of life is captured in her works. With that, I come to Mrs. Dalloway. Mrs. Dalloway takes us to that river where memory and time merge, and we glimpse not only what her characters have lived, but also what they feel. And this is a novel that unfolds over a single day, yet it contains entire lives within it. Clarissa Dalloway steps out to buy flowers for a party, and in that simple act, Virginia Woolf opens a window into memory, into longing, youthful hopes, and the choices that shape a life. What is most remarkable is how time breathes in this novel. The sound of Big Ben is like a heartbeat, steady and unrelenting, reminding us of how life moves forward even as our minds drift backwards. She says, another quote, she felt somehow very like him, the young man who had killed himself. She felt glad that he had done it, thrown it away. The clock was striking. And then there is Septimus, the war veteran, whose struggle runs in quiet counterpoint to Clarissa's social preparations, showing how joy and sorrow coexist in the same city, the same day, sometimes even within the same person. In Mrs. Dalloway, Woolf shows us that beneath the surface of ordinary life lies an ocean of feeling, regret, hope, fear, and love. It invites us to slow down and to recognize the inner worlds of others and of ourselves. One more quote. She always had the feeling that it was very, very dangerous to live even one day. Well, you are all scholars of Virginia Woolf, and you probably understand what she means out here. Now we come to the panel, today's panel, and some of them are here on the screen. I will begin with Harish Trivedi, Professor Harish Trivedi. Harish Trivedi. Hi, Harish. Good to have you here on our panel today. Yeah. He is a professor in the department. He has been a professor in the Department of English, Delhi University. He is a widely known scholar of post-colonialism and translation studies and so much more. I can't give you a long list of all the things that he's an expert in, but he does have a lot of credibility, a lot of respect in academia. He was a Commonwealth Scholar in the University of Wales, UK, Honorary Research Fellow in Birmingham. He's also been a visiting international scholar at the University of Georgia in the USA, and he's held very respectable positions in various international associations. The CV is very long. He has written a lot, and he has a lot of visibility, not just in India, but abroad also. And on the personal level, I must tell you that Harish Trivedi is one person I have tremendous respect for. Why? Because he does not wear his learning in a very pompous manner. He wears it lightly. He can laugh at it. He can, with wit, he can temper his learning, his knowledge with wit. And that is something that most of us are not able to do. So Harish, so happy to have you here, and I'll introduce the others as and when we come to them, but let's begin with you. This is the first time you've come to our platform, to our forum, and I'm sure you will like it as much as the conference that you attended recently in Dharamshala, where it was, you have attended one before, but it was very nice seeing you after a long spell in Dharamshala, and it's very nice seeing you here on the screen. So let's see, what would you like to say about this 100-year-old lady that we are so mesmerized by? Harish Trivedi, over to you, and the rest of us can remain muted. Okay, this you can be on the screen if you wish, but remain muted, please. Over to you, Harish Trivedi, and thank you once again for joining us. We have other stalwarts here too. Professor Dhar is here, Professor Anil Prasad. We'll come to them by and by. Harish.
Very much, Manju. Thank you. It's a joy to be here. As you recap, I was there in Dharamshala after a long gap. I was earlier in Chandigarh at one of your annual conferences. It's wonderful to reconnect with Melo, and I'm honored to have this opportunity to speak here. You gave a wonderful introduction to the novel, to Virginia Woolf, and you gave a no less wonderful introduction to me. Thank you very much for that. I must say that, this seems to be extremely well organized, this panel. Number of speakers, the great diversity and range of the topics that they have chosen to speak on is very vivid so far as the critical tidings of our current times are concerned. Wonderful to be part of it. You talked about the old lady in your title. The old lady is very accurate. It sounds a bit, familiar, and sounds a bit affectionate, and sounds perhaps also a bit mocking. But the old lady was certainly a lady. Mrs. Dalloway is not a woman; she is a lady, in terms of the class that she belongs to and how she acts. And she's a little older than we think. She's not 100 years old. In fact, when the novel is set on that day in June, she is 51. So she is 151 years old. The novel, in fact, takes us even further back. But before that, I'm not that young myself. Of the 100 years that the novel has been on this planet, I've also been sharing, knowingly or unknowingly, the planetary life available to us for 78 years. So that's pretty substantial. That's 3/4. But I'll go into a deeper chronological background in a moment. The novel actually goes back. There is one part of Virginia Woolf's technique that the present is not only the present. The present also embodies and reminds us of the past, which is revisited in memory. She's the novelist of memory very often. So much of the action in any novel of hers actually happens in the past, which is now recollected, not in tranquility either. Remembrance of things past, as Proust put it, is always there in all her novels, except the first two, which were apprentice work and don't count, The Voyage Out and Night and Day. In Mrs. Dalloway, the chronological scheme is that the oldest character that we have in the novel is Miss Helena Parry, who is Clarissa's or Mrs. Dalloway's aunt. She comes to the party. She is mentioned several times when she recalls her time in Bhutan when she was young, Clarissa, and she's now 80 years old. So we go back 80 years from 1925, and we get to 1945. And she has a connection with India. We don't know very much about her, but she's been to India several times because she is a botanist, and she wants to collect Himalayan flora. And she remembers traveling, or at least the narrator remembers her traveling on the backs of coolies, in those doolies, as they were called in the mountains, several times in these Himalayan expeditions. And she has stayed with 4 viceroys. She's so well placed herself socially as to move in those circles. There's a very important dimension for 2 reasons. Most readers perhaps miss it, because it's very minor. She is minor, her background is minor, but those of us who read her in India, Virginia Woolf, and Mrs. Dalloway in particular, have every reason to notice each detail like this. There is a strong Indian dimension to Mrs. Dalloway. Strong not in terms of how the novel proceeds, how the novel is constituted, but strong in comparison with her other novels. India is more important, more prominent in this novel than in any other. And it's not Helena Parry who's the important character, it's Peter Walsh, who serves as an Indian civil servant in India ever since being rejected as a passionate suitor of Clarissa. And she marries instead, very conventionally, very safely, a man who becomes a Tory MP. And that's how she lives in Westminster and gets to get that party. I'd love to imagine what would have happened had she married Peter Walsh and come out to India as a Mem Sahib and would have lived another kind of life altogether. It's worth speculating about. There's a very close thing. She could have married Peter Walsh. But let's go back to another connection. As I said, Miss Helen Parry, aunt, seems to be born in 1845. If she first came to India when she was 25 or something like that, that'll make it 1869. In 1869, something actually happened in Virginia Woolf's family. Not Clarissa Dalloway's family, but Virginia Woolf's own family. Her uncle came up to India. The uncle becomes the aunt in the novel. The uncle was Sir James Fitzjames Stephen. Her father was Sir Leslie Stephen, and the uncle was, again, unlike Leslie Stephen, who was a scholar, who was a philosopher, who was a don at Cambridge. Fitzjames was a lawyer, a very eminent legal expert. And she came out to India to fill the same position that Lord Macaulay had filled earlier, the law member of the Council of the Viceroy. And he drafted and had passed, got enacted many provisions which are still running in India with a few modifications and some with none. For example, the Indian Evidence Act, drafted by him at that time. But Mrs. Dalloway doesn't know about it. Virginia Woolf doesn't go into it. Only I know about it because I've dug it up. And I think that as readers in India, we should all dig up such things. It's for us to read it differently and not pretend to be the British or the Americans reading it. As you said in your introduction, you brought it out extremely well. The inner life, look within, shower of atoms. That was the main reputation of Virginia Woolf for a long time. The first major novel in that regard, the first novel that she attempted in this way was her third novel, Jacob's Room, 1922. For that, she was attacked. For that, she was criticized by people as diverse as Anil Bennett and Middleton Murray, who thought that method could not work, could not be repeated. So Mrs. Dalloway is a challenge. Virginia Woolf wants to show that it can work and work extremely well and work even better than it could in Jacob's Room. This is, as you very well described, the life within, the depiction of the life within, a fragmentary kind of structure of the novel, which is more fluid, more floating than novels by the Victorians or even the Edwardians who followed in the 20th century. This is her originality as a novelist. If she has a claim to almost blazing and blinding originality as a writer, it is in this respect, exploring the life within in a way that it has not been explored ever before. James Joyce was doing it at about the same time. Proust, beginning to be translated, was doing it, but there were no other models, not even Henry James. He did not do it in quite the same way. These people went deeper. So that's a great claim to originality. Now, as I said, I have a personal history of connection with Virginia Woolf. I devoted 4 years of my golden youth to studying her, doing a PhD on her. And that was in Britain on the scholarship that you mentioned, the Commonwealth Scholarship. I began reading Virginia Woolf in 1966. So that's about 60 years ago. And I then, in 71, I went abroad. In 75, I completed my PhD on her. I remember with great warmth and gratitude my supervisor there, Frank W. Bradbrook, marvelous man, who, by his own example, by practice and not precept, taught me all I know about what it is to be a scholar. It's a wonderful education. Now, my own history running alongside in 66, I, I began reading Virginia Woolf. In 1970, I published, while still in India, my first paper on Virginia Woolf. It is in this book, Essays and Studies, very Oxfordian title, edited by the head of the department at our university in Allahabad, who had, of course, an Oxford training and degree, K.K. Mehrotra. My article was titled The Unreadability of Virginia Woolf. Unreadability within quotation marks, scare quotes, as we call them now. Well, I mean, she is difficult to read. All of us find her difficult to read. She is not exactly Chetan Bhagat. She is not Salman Rushdie either. The difficulty lies in what she is attempting to do for the first time. It's not willful obscurity. It's a new method. We are not aware of it. We don't know how to tune into it. And therein is the difficulty. It's not difficult words. It's not puns. It's not obscure allusions, as, for example, in James Joyce. This is difficulty of another kind altogether. So that was the unreadability, quote unquote, of Virginia Woolf that I began with. My PhD was completed, as I said, in 1975. One of the many things wrong with it is that it is about 550 pages long. If I had, if I had any sense, I would have made it 200, and this is my PhD. And if I had any sense, if I had less ambition and more sense, then I would have made it half the size and more coherent and more cogent. Dharsab, good to see you. But it's yeah, right. I see you big and
I'm
large.
enjoying it.
Yeah, large on my screen. Now, my having got to Virginia Woolf at that time and having studied her is not only a qualification, but it's also perhaps a disqualification. You may think that I'm a dinosaur. You may think that I'm a fossil, having done my work then, or perhaps the fossil of a dinosaur. So what I did was, not because of Mrs. I'm sorry, Manju is distracting. Wonderful to see Dhar Sahab, but he's big on my screen. Can he be? Can we do something about it so that?
But he's
Anyhow,
not on our screen. He's not
yeah,
on our screen. Yeah.
wonderful. Yeah. Now you're big on my screen, and that's something I'm accustomed to. Yeah. No, that's fine. That's fine.
See, whoever speaks
Yeah.
comes onto the screen.
But Dhar Sahab was being very polite and not even coughing. Yeah. Anyhow, now what I have done is this year, because of the centenary of Mrs. Dalloway, after a gap of 50 years, I've actually gone back to Virginia Woolf. When I came back from Britain, I decided I will not do any more British literature. It's not our literature. It took me to go to Britain and live there to find that out. I began doing comparative literature when I came back. I began doing translation studies. I began doing Indian literature by itself. And lately I've been doing world literature, and all through these interests of mine has run, as you pointed out in the introduction, the base of post-colonial studies from that point of view. So I have this year renovated myself and refurbished myself and repurposed myself as somebody interested in Woolf. And what I'd like to share with you is how I've done it. This year, I have written 4 little articles on Virginia Woolf, not 1 or 2, but 4. I began with one I didn't want to write anymore that appeared in the Indian Express about her and her connection with the Raj, as I've already hinted. Then other opportunities arose, and I have followed them, I have taken them up. One thing that I did was I bought a very expensive book because, I could hardly afford it. It is the manuscript of Mrs. Dalloway when it was called The Hours. It's also a fat book, and it had to be imported, especially one copy from Britain, because there's no demand for it here. It was published some time ago, 2010. What we may like to know is that the novel here does not begin with Mrs. Dalloway said she would buy the flowers herself. That's not the opening sentence. Her walk in London is not the opening sequence. The novel begins with Peter Walsh. Is Peter Walsh who's walking around London? Is Peter Walsh who has a very long initial section to himself? The centrality of India would have been better emphasized had Peter Walsh got more space, such as he had in the first draft. Anyhow, so that's one kind of interest. The next point of interest for me was, and I've got all physical evidence here, this book came out this year. It's called Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf, Biography of a Novel. Biography of a Novel is the new series launched by Manchester University Press in Britain. They also published a book by me, I don't know, God knows how many years ago. My Colonial Transactions came out first here, then by them in an international edition many, many years ago. It's by Mark Hussey. I've reviewed it. I've gone into what he goes into. He describes the 100-year life of the novel from its conception, the many revisions of the conception, the many drafts, to publication, to reception, and to the changing reputation of her over the 100 years, and also many spin-offs, translations, adaptations, most notably, of course, the film, the novel and the film called The Hours by Michael Cunningham, which in recent decades has had more of a success than even Mrs. Dalloway, the novel by Virginia Woolf. This is what happens in our age. It's a film, it won Oscars, so people run after it, then they read the book, perhaps half of them would watch the film. He goes over all that. He is such a fierce defender, Mark Hussey, of the reputation of Virginia Woolf. So it struck me that he ignores, discounts even the introduction that Virginia Woolf wrote to Mrs. Dalloway. 2 years later or 4 years later, novel is 1925. In a new edition, she actually wrote a preface, the only one to any of her novels, in which she revealed that there was no Septimus in the original conception, and that in that original conception, it was Clarissa who was supposed to commit suicide at the end. Now, Mark Hussey can't accept it for some reason. And though Virginia Woolf says it quite clearly in that introduction or preface, Hussey says there is no other supporting evidence for it. What does he want? But these are the ways of interpreting Virginia Woolf and defending what has now become the conventional reading, the standard reading of that novel. Then another book came out by the Lionel Trilling, professor of English at Columbia. It's called The Inner Life of Mrs. Dalloway, what you were talking about, Manju. You know, in your introduction, you emphasized, I think, more than any other aspect of Virginia Woolf, her reputation as a psychological experimental novelist that we all knew when we were reading her before, that I and you share in our generation. And that has been still, for many of us, the base of a reputation.
I'm not a Woolf expert.
Yeah, yeah. Edward Mendelssohn is this critic, and he goes into something that is very different from Mark Hussey's account. Mark Hussey describes the life in this world of the novel, its reputation, its reception, its adaptations, and so on, as I said. Mendelssohn offers a kind of a textual analysis, a close reading of the Chicago School and Cambridge kind of the major characters. And he again, the major characters are three. There's Clarissa, there is Peter Walsh, and there is Septimus. He has chapters that focus on all these under different titles. For example, the first chapter is Medicine, the second is Empire, the third is Love, all with the inner life. So these are the ways in which we have got back to Virginia Woolf by catching up with the latest that's being published and where the state of play is in Virginia Woolf studies. I've also reviewed this book. Now, as it happened, I wrote these reviews some time ago, a couple of months ago in one case, more than that in another case, but they're all coming out together in this month. One will be in the book review, another will be in Frontline, and then there is yet another article, the fourth article, which I was attracted to because Virginia Woolf Miscellany, a publication run by the association in America, Virginia Woolf Association Society, Virginia Woolf Miscellany is called, they announced a special issue on the theme Virginia Woolf and Failure. It seemed such a fascinating topic. So I wrote for it, and I ran into deep trouble with the editors after they had accepted it, when only copy editing remained. And that was an engagement like I haven't had before with any article of mine. It's quite an education. For example, this is what feminism can do. They told me that some of the quotations that I had used could not be relied on, actual quotations, because they were by male critics, such as feminism. So I said, who are you writing it to? What do you think I am? In that case, I should also be ruled out. Why are you accepting my article to publish? So there were a number of interesting debates and so on. Finally, I wish to remind all of us that there is another novel which was published 100 years ago, whose centenary is not being celebrated, even though it's an Indian novel. It's being celebrated in a very minor fashion, almost invisible fashion in Hindi, because it's a Hindi novel. It's the best novel, I think, by Premchand, and Premchand agreed with me. Premchand said before Godan was published, he was asked many times, Godan was published only a few months before his death. This was published, as I've indicated, in 1925, same year as Mrs Dalloway. Now, such is the reputation of writers. Everybody knows Premchand by Godan and one or two stories. This novel is called Rangabhoomi. It's about twice the size of Godan, also in scope. It's quite political, far more openly political. The hero of the novel is shot dead by the British collector at the end of the novel. What could be more political? I wish to write a fifth article, perhaps not here, but next year, putting these two centenary novels together in all kinds of ways. I think that's quite enough by way of updating myself, plugging back into Virginia Woolf in several kinds of ways. Manju, thank you very much. Thank you, Melo, and thank you all who have listened patiently. Thank you.
Thank you, Harish. We could go on listening to you endlessly because it was really riveting. We enjoyed whatever you told us, the personal memoir, the the way you went into Virginia Woolf, Mrs. Dalloway, and all the connections that you made. And, with your characteristic wit and humor, I think everybody enjoyed it. Thank you so much. But please stay with
Yeah,
us.
I will. I
Yeah,
will.
we have some
Yeah.
more speakers, and we'll have
Well,
another round at the end. We'll have another round
yeah.
summing it all up. Yeah. The next speaker that we have is Professor Anil Prasad. Now, just 1 minute, let me just adjust the view. Okay. So we have Professor Anil Prasad, and Professor Anil Prasad is he retired. He's a retired professor, former head of the department at Patna University, and he has taught at universities across India, the Middle East, and Africa. He is also a multilingual poet and storyteller, writes in Hindi, English, and Bhojpuri, and his works have been translated into Arabic and Chinese. His academic contributions to English language, literature, and higher education have been widely recognized, with research papers presented in countries as far-flung as, the US, the Middle East, and, many more. He is widely published and he has a lot of encyclopedia articles. He's translated a lot of work. He's translated selected chapters of Yashpal's celebrated novel Jhuta Sach, published by the Sahitya Academy. And among the many awards he has received is the Saket Sahit Shikhar Samman from Social and Motivational Trust, New Delhi, the Lifetime Achievement Award 2024 from the Bihar Human Rights Association for his dedication to teaching and education, and the Bihar Gaurav Samman 2025, jointly awarded by Manavadhikar Today, Bihar, and the SARC Journalist Forum, and Saraswat Samman 2025. So we have quite a celebrity out here, and currently he serves as the secretary of the Human Rights Association Bihar, patron of the Patna chapter of the Social Motivational Trust, New Delhi, and a member of the Society for Empowerment Bihar, where he continues to play an active role in education and social initiatives. Professor Prasad, thank you for being with us today. And incidentally, Professor Prasad has been with us for a number of our activities, conferences, and sessions like this, I think for the last 5 years. Professor Prasad, over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for this generous introduction. One correction, I was not heading the department at Patna University. Outside India, wherever I worked, I was heading the department in Yemen, Libya, and Saudi Arabia. I studied at Patna University. I made MA and I did my PhD from Patna University. So thank you very much for inviting me to this panel that is so I am so proud of to be on this, and it is my pleasure and privilege to speak today on a theme that is increasingly relevant in contemporary literary studies, the intersection of ecology and modernist fiction. My talk today is titled, as it is announced, An Ecological Reading of Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway. When we think of Mrs. Dalloway, we usually think of a stream of consciousness narration, its portrayal of post-World War I Britain, or its exploration of identity, memory, and social performance, just mentioned by Professor Trivedi. But today, I invite you to look at the novel through a different lens, an ecological lens, one that reveals how Woolf depicts the human mind, the urban environment, and the natural world as deeply interconnected. We live in a moment when environmental consciousness shapes our understanding of literature. Scholars like Lawrence Buell, Jonathan Bate, and Ursula Hayes, and Cyril Glotfelty remind us that literature not only reflects ecological reality, but actively shapes how societies imagine the natural world. When we apply this approach to Mrs. Dalloway, we discover a text that is far more environmentally attuned than many earlier critics assumed. Woolf's London is not merely a setting, it is a living organism, as we have already experienced in Wordsworth's famous sonnet London and in Eliot's famous poem published in 1922, The Westland. Woolf's London is not merely a setting, it is a living organism, breathing, pulsating, responding. Nature in the novel is not passive, it is active force shaping the inner lives of characters. Clarissa's consciousness is profoundly shaped by her sensory interaction with the natural world. In the very opening pages of the novel, she steps out into the London morning and the novelist writes, quote, "What a lark, what a plunge," unquote. This plunge is more than enthusiastic plunge for the day's events. It is a plunge into a sensory world, into air, light, and movement. Throughout the novel, Clarissa draws emotional stability from fragments of nature, the whisper of leaves, the glimmer of sunlight, the scent of flowers. She walks through Westminster not merely as a pedestrian, but as someone actually aware of nature's presence, even within the urban environment. The novelist writes again, quote, "She felt very young, at the same time unspeakably aged. She sliced like a knife through everything," unquote. This mix of youthfulness, age, and sharp perception emerges from the ecological richness of her surroundings. Clarissa represents the modern individual who seeks grounding in an increasingly mechanized world through moments of contact with the natural. One of the most striking achievements of Mrs. Dalloway is Woolf's portrayal of London as a living, breathing ecosystem. Woolf describes the city not as a collection of buildings and roads, but as an organism with rhythm, moods, and pulses. Early in the novel, we encounter a brilliant line, "In people's eyes, in the swing, tramp, and trudge, there was London," unquote. Here, nature, humanity, and machinery merge into a single tapestry. The city's ecology, its air, light, noise, and movement forms a network in which all characters live. We notice that Woolf juxtaposes natural rhythms with mechanical interruptions. The birds and trees coexist with motor cars, airplanes, and big men. Each element interacts with the other, sometimes in harmony and sometimes in conflict. It is impossible to discuss ecology in Mrs. Dalloway without addressing the symbolic role of flowers. The novel famously begins with, quote, "Mrs. Dalloway said she would buy the flowers herself," unquote. This is not accidental. Flowers are central to Clarissa's identity, her memories, her role as a hostess. They represent beauty, transience, and the human tendency to shape and use the natural world for social purposes. Later in the novel, Woolf writes of the flowers, quote, "The roses, the carnations, the irises were all breathing, soaking up the light." She attributes life, breath, and agency to the flowers, subtly reminding us that these are not mere decorations. They are living beings whose vitality animates Clarissa's social world. This perspective anticipates modern ecological thinking, which recognizes the agency of non-human life forms. If Clarissa represents a gentle ecological sensitivity, Septimus represents ecological oversensitivity, a painful, traumatic attunement to the world around him. Septimus has lost emotional feeling because of his trauma from the war, yet he possesses an almost mystical connection with nature. Woolf writes, quote, "The leaves being connected by millions of fibers with his own body," unquote. This is one of the most ecologically significant sentences in modernist literature. Septimus experiences nature not as something separate from himself, but as an extension of his own being. He intuits interconnectedness of all life, what deep ecology would later theorize. But Woolf also shows how modernity destroys this ecological harmony. The doctors who treat Septimus reduce him to a case, stripping away his connection to the natural world. The industrial war machine has scarred his ability to live within the ecological web he still perceives. Woolf carefully contrasts natural elements with mechanical intrusions. The motor car that appears early in the novel is described as embodying power. Quote, "The motor car, with its blinds drawn, was the end of all pleasures." Unquote. Its presence disrupts the ecology of a street, creating noise, tension, and fascination. The airplane that rides in the sky similarly disturbs the natural order. Quote, "The sound of the aeroplane bored ominously into the ears of the crowd." Unquote. The sky, once a place of majesty and birds, now becomes a space for advertisement. Woolf is here critiquing modernity's colonization of nature. She anticipates today's discussions about environmental degradation and urban pollution. The climax of the novel reinforces the ecological theme of interconnectedness. Clarissa learns of Septimus's suicide during the party. Instead of dismissing the event, she feels a profound kinship with him. The novelist says, "She felt somehow very like him, the young man who had killed himself." This moment is not merely emotional sympathy, it is an ecological connection, a recognition that all human beings are part of a fragile web of existence. She reflects, quote, "She felt herself everywhere, not here, here, here." This dissolution of the ego echoes ecological thought. The self extends into the world, and the world extends into the self. Life and death, joy and suffering, nature and society, all are interconnected strands of a larger web. Woolf was not an environmental activist in the modern sense, yet her writing anticipates key ideas of ecological philosophy: the interdependence of all living beings, the psychological need for contact with the natural world, the critique of modernity's alienation from nature, the recognition of non-human agency, the fragility of ecological balance in urban life. The scholars like Elizabeth Otka and Bonnie Kim Scott argue that Woolf's fiction reveals a sophisticated ecological consciousness even before ecology became a formal discipline. In Mrs. Dalloway, Woolf reminds us that the modern world, with its machines, wars, and anxieties, has not destroyed nature, but has made us more aware of our dependence on it. In conclusion, I would like to say that in a world facing climate change, urban pollution, and ecological destruction, reading Woolf ecologically is not just intellectually enriching, it is ethically necessary. Mrs. Dalloway teaches us that nature shapes our mental health. Urban environments are ecological systems. Modernity can alienate us from the natural world. Beauty and fragility coexist, as it is evident from her party, and every individual life is part of a larger ecological web. Woolf's ecological imagination helps us see that human life cannot be understood apart from its environment. Her novel becomes a meditation, not only on identity and society, but also on the delicate balance that sustains life itself. An ecological reading of Mrs. Dalloway reveals that Woolf was profoundly attuned to the relations between humans, nature, urban spaces, and modern technology. Through Clarissa's sensory consciousness and Septimus's ecological hypersensitivity, Woolf positions nature not merely as setting, but as a vital force that sustains, shapes, and sometimes destroys human experience. Her London anticipates contemporary concerns about environmental alienation, ecological fragility, and the psychological need for communion with the natural world. In the end, Woolf urges us to the rustle of leaves, the movement of air, the rhythms of the city, and the quiet, persistent voice of nature calling us back into relationship. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Prasad. You've taken us in a different direction altogether, different from the traditional scholarship of Virginia Woolf that we have been familiar with. I think in times today, this is a very important angle of study, and our young scholars would do well to focus on this aspect also, because ecology, the connectedness between the human and the natural world is something that we are all concerned with today. So thank you very much for that insightful talk. We move on to the next speaker now, and that is Antara Ghatak. Antara, you're there? Yeah. Unmute yourself. Antara is an assistant professor and the coordinator of the postgraduate course in the Department of English, St. Xavier's University, Kolkata. She holds her MPhil and PhD degrees in English literature from the University of Calcutta. Her research focuses on gender studies and memory studies, and she has an interest in research relating to genocidal communities and the partition of India. Antara has participated in conferences and seminars, both nationally and internationally. She has publications on gender and the partition with Routledge, with the Orient Black Swan, and she's a certified citizen historian from Stanford University and takes a keen interest in archiving documents related to post-conflict societies. So this is Antara Ghatak. And Antara, let's see what you have to say on Mrs. Dalloway. Over to you, Antara.
A very good evening. Thank you, ma'am, for the introduction. And may I say that I'm humbled to be in presence of such teachers, I would say, like Professor Trivedi and Prasad, and my esteemed panelists here. What I would like to speak on is that the pertinence of reading Mrs. Dalloway in post-conflict times, the times that we are living in. So that is what I thought that I would talk about. The year 2025 marks the literary milestone for the publication of modern fiction, Mrs. Dalloway, not only as a feminist text or an experimental novel, but I think it is also a scathing commentary on the post-conflict society. It reflects the myriad impressions of human minds with its joys, ruptures, and the relentless attempts to make meaning in a world shadowed by the catastrophes, wars, and conflicts. As it steps into the centenary year, it enters not as a relic, but as a mirror to the trials and the tribulations of the world hit by conflicts. Reading Mrs. Dalloway in the context of living in a world strewn with conflicts becomes pertinent, especially with the Russia-Ukraine war going at the backdrop, or the Israel-Palestine conflict. So it is a kind of me thinking back, taking a text and see that how is it relevant to all these violence taking place in the entire world. As ma'am has already said in the introduction, we know that moving in and out of the characters' minds using stream of consciousness technique to explore the outer and the inner state of consciousness, the novel chronicled the events in the life of a single day of a 51-year-old Clarissa Dalloway, an upper-class English woman who is paired with a 30-year-old Septimus Smith, the shell-shock veteran of the Great War. In a rather small spatial segment, Woolf represents the whole breadth of the London milieu in a certain June day of 1923, 5 years after the armistice and after the Londoners had been through World War I. So that is an experience that has been so shattering, terrible, and transformative. It is a curious thing that modernity, or the consciousness of living in post-war London, transcribed by Virginia Woolf 100 years ago, should still throb with vitality in our own postmodern living condition, with new wars, mass displacement, and the psychic aftermath of violence. Septimus Smith in Mrs Dalloway is an irrefutable proof of a direct concern with one of the most tangible aspects of her contemporary political situation. I say that from Mark Hussey. I was reading up Mark Hussey as well, as Sir has said. So this is a society trying, the London society that Woolf has portrayed. It is a society trying to negotiate with the perils of the war. The fragile veteran hallucinating in Regent's Park in London becomes not a fictional figure, but I think he becomes a contemporary one. The ghost, perhaps, of every soldier wallowing in the streets of Bucha or Mariupol of Ukraine in our recent times. There is, to an eerie similarity between the war-ravaged Londoners and the victims like Bitan and Adil of the Pahalgam terrorist attack that is evoked in the line in the novel. I quote, "The war was over except for someone like Mrs. Foxcroft and Joan killed." Moreover, the centenary of Mrs. Dalloway is not merely a literary occasion. It is a reckoning, a reminder of the spectrality of the war. It is a comment on the grotesqueness of modernity, warfare, and death. It is during war, if we look at war from a theoretical perspective, maybe say that it is during the war that the body is subsumed in the higher political or the nationalistic discourse, denying the idea of a man being free, conscious political subject, and characterizing modern identity through the concept of bare life or life exposed to death. The First World War initiated the possibility of death organized politically through bureaucratic planning and governmental decisions, reflecting the way in which modern warfare caused the body to shift into a zone of indistinction. Woolf's depiction of Septimus is a kind of a proof that warfare adorns a new mask in modern culture, and the death of countless civilians during that time seemingly degraded into a frantic random military action which lacked any form of accountability by the end of 1918. From the shell-shocked victim of World War I, Septimus's gaze turned into, I quote, the 1,000-yard stare of the Second World War, which is a clinical term, and later it has a clinical vocabulary known as the post-traumatic syndrome disorder, or the PTSD, which is a current kind of condition that we can talk about the victims in Gaza or Palestine. Septimus is Woolf's cry against the casualness with society's absorbed trauma. Many of Woolf's writings are an explicit anti-war attack. And it is in this context, may I just read out 2 lines from her other essay, which becomes pertinent with reading how conflict hits us. So it is from her essay, I quote, "Thoughts on Peace and Air Raid," which was written in 1940. This is what she has to say in the context of blackouts and air raids in the borders, where she says, I quote, these are very poignant lines. "It is a queer experience lying in the dark and listening to the zoom of the hornet, which may at any moment sting to you to death. It is a sound that interrupts cool and consecutive thinking about peace. Yet it is a sound far more than prayers and anthems that should compel one to think about peace. Unless we think peace into existence, we, not this one body in this one bed, but millions of bodies yet to be born, will lie in same darkness and hear the same death rattle overhead." Close quote. Mrs. Dalloway endures as a prose, as a lyrical poem, as a visionary and a commentary on how our private lives are shaped by global forces, empire, war, religion, patriarchy, and power. The novel becomes a warning against the spectrality of war, looming over the consequences of the post-Pahalgam attack. If you remember the time that how, the air raids were happening after this terrorist attack. So it is and a war was a possibility then. And people knew about the spectrality, but people did not know about the consequences of the war. That was something which Woolf had already talked about, how it affects lives, how it affects individuals and private lives of people. And this is a novel becomes a warning against the spectrality of war looming large over the country in the consequence of the post-Pahalgam attack, and at the same time, a prayer for peace, reminding us that the Great War had only, I quote, bred in them, all men and women, a well of tears, close quote. Mrs. Dalloway, aka Virginia Woolf, stands as a reminder of the trauma and the triumph of human conditions in the midst of euphoria, nationalism, terror, ecstasy, and the incandescence of human nature. 100 years on, and it still fills us with extraordinary excitement, ecstasy, as Peter Walsh would end a novel to read Mrs. Dalloway, for there she was, carrying forward the ravages of war through her literary self. Just one more concluding statement I have. As Sir had pointed out, when I read Mrs. Dalloway as a 20-year-old, it was actually, the unreadability of Woolf. We did not understand, as Sir had pointed out. And then as we grew in time, when you take up Mrs. Dalloway, it has different meanings for us. And definitely when I'm reading this in the context of the Russia conflict or the Palestine-Gaza conflict, in context of the survivors, families, survivors, victims, I do read it. I do think that it is such a pertinent novel, not only, looking at the gendered concept of self, but as a collective, human lens, ma'am. That is what I have to say.
Thank you. Thank you, Antara. So this was Antara Ghatak talking about the context, the post-conflict context in Mrs. Dalloway. And again, this is a perspective that traditional critics have not really taken up. Antara, tell me, did you also do your PhD on Virginia Woolf or on Mrs. Dalloway? What is your interest?
It was on the 1971 war, memory and gender.
Right,
so,
right. But Mrs. Dalloway is one of your favorite texts.
I took that up and concluded my dissertation with the line that as a woman I have no country, and as a woman I want no country.
Oh,
so that I did
right. Okay. Thank you, Antara. And we move on to the next speaker. The next speaker is Sangeeta Sanya. No, Ritushri. Ritushri, are you there? Ritushri Sengupta. Ritushri Sengupta. Yeah, you're there.
Okay.
And she is a Fulbright alumna, 22-23, who was posted at Indiana University. And at present, she is an assistant professor of English at Patrasayar Mahavidyalaya, affiliated to Bankura University. And she also holds the office of the IQAC coordinator. Wow. Now, she's done her MA from Vishwa Bharati, and she was an exchange program student in China. She's been awarded a funded research residency in London. She has published research papers in several national and international journals of repute, and she has a few international anthologies to her name. Wow. Her research interests include children's literature, post-colonial, Bengali, and eco-criticism. And she has recently completed her postdoc work from BITS Pilani in Rajasthan. So this is Sangeeta Sanyal, and we have Sangeeta. Sangeeta, what are you going to speak on? Let me just put you as a speaker. Yes, over to you, Sangeeta.
Ma'am, you mean Ritushri?
Yes, I
Oh,
believe
I'm so
yes.
sorry. Yeah. So this is Ritushri. So Ritushri will be speaking to us now. Ritushri, tell us what you're going to speak on.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for your warm introduction. And the topic that I chose to speak on today is mental health and modern society, a contemporary reading of Mrs. Dalloway. I thought of discussing mental health. Although the novel was published in 1925 as a work of fiction, its portrayal of psychological struggle, social pressure, and emotional isolation speaks powerfully to the issues we face today. At its core, Mrs. Dalloway is a novel about inner lives, those private battles people fight behind polished surfaces. Woolf talks about that. Her stream of consciousness technique allows us to move between characters' minds, revealing how much remains unspoken in social settings. This resonates strongly with our own era, where discussions about mental health have grown more open. Yet stigma and silence still persist. The character who most directly, I'm so sorry, just a moment. Just a moment. Yeah, I'm very sorry. So the stigma about mental health is still very much there in our society today. The character who most directly embodies the theme of mental illness is Septimus Warren Smith, a veteran suffering from what we now understand as PTSD. We must note this, that at the time when Woolf was writing this, PTSD as a clinical term was not that well known. Still, she understood the problems that Septimus was facing, and she understood it with empathy. His symptoms, flashbacks, emotional numbness, auditory hallucinations, and profound despair, mirror clinical descriptions today. Uh, and more importantly, Woolf exposes the failures of the society and medical system around him. Septimus is repeatedly told to cheer up, to think of his duties, to suppress his emotions. His doctors misinterpret his condition as weakness or lack of discipline. In this way, Woolf critiques a system that values conformity over compassion. When we read Septimus through a contemporary lens, we see parallels to modern debates around mental health. Long waiting lists for care, environments that reward productivity over well being, and lingering prejudice toward emotional vulnerability. Even a century later, many people still hesitate to seek help for fear of being judged, misunderstood, or dismissed, just as Septimus. His tragic end serves as a powerful reminder of the consequences of neglecting mental health. On the other hand, Woolf presents Clarissa Dalloway, a woman who appears composed and successful, but whose inner monologue reveals anxiety, past trauma, and moments of existential doubt. She represents the subtler forms of psychological distress, what we might today call high functioning anxiety. Clarissa moves through a day of party planning, but her thoughts constantly drift to questions of identity, fulfillment, and mortality. This duality, outward confidence coupled with inward fragility, is extremely relevant in the age of social media, where many people curate perfect images of their lives while privately struggling. Clarissa's final reaction to Septimus's death is especially significant. She feels a shock of recognition, a sense of connection to someone she never met. In that moment, Woolf suggests that mental suffering is universal, not limited to a specific class, gender, or circumstance. This idea aligns with modern mental health discourse. Everyone, regardless of background, has an emotional life that deserves attention and empathy. Another way the novel speaks to modern society is through the setting. A single day in London filled with constant movement, noise, and sensory overload. This environment mirrors our fast paced contemporary world, where the pressure to keep up can feel overwhelming. Woolf shows how easily people become disconnected from one another, even as they share the same streets. Today, despite being more digitally connected than ever, many still experience loneliness and emotional isolation. The worst is nobody talks about it. In its and bits they do, but the loneliness that eats all of us somewhere, some manage to live with it, some struggle, but nobody really talks in detail. Like they don't talk regularly. There are no support groups. Like there are some, and they're most of the time too expensive. In conclusion, reading Mrs. Dalloway through the lens of mental health reveals just how forward thinking Woolf was. Her novel highlights themes that remain urgently relevant: the need for compassionate healthcare, preferably a little less expensive too, the dangers of social pressure, the hidden nature of emotional pain, and the importance of understanding one another's inner worlds. As modern society continues to confront mental health challenges, Woolf's work invites us to listen more carefully, to question the systems that shape our well being, and to recognize the humanity in each individual story. I personally want to share this thing that in several help groups who are helping individuals battling depression, Wolf's works are often suggested to patients who are uh, suffering from lack of understanding the reality. There are support groups who recommend authors like Woolf, and I think we should all look at Woolf, who herself was struggling. It's not easy when one struggles. It's not easy to reach out to someone else who's also struggling, but we've tried, and she did very well, I guess. So thank you.
Thank you, Ritushri. So once again, we have a different angle, a different perspective on Mrs. Dalloway. And I like the way you have brought the novel into the present times, particularly post-COVID, particularly the mental depression that we have experienced, that we've heard about during the COVID times. So thank you very much for that. And we'll move on to the next speaker, who is Sangeeta Sanyal. Sorry for the goof up earlier, Sangeeta.
It's perfectly all right, ma'am.
Sangeeta teaches English at the UG, PG, and B.Ed levels at Loreto College, Kolkata. And her major areas of interest include gender studies, translation and language studies, literature of the 20th century, Indian writing in English, Tagore's literature, etc. Now, that's quite a handful, huh? And Sangeeta will be talking to us about the presence of Big Ben. Incidentally, we had this talk on the post-conflict context, and we have another speaker who will be speaking on the same subject, but perhaps from a different angle. So right now we have Sangeeta, and over to you, Sangeeta.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much. Hello, good evening, all of you. At the outset, let me thank Mello to include me in this evening's panel and its discussion. I would briefly speak on the presence of the Big Ben in the novel as the most resonant symbol that weaves together threads of memory, perception with social continuity, and the historical time in post-war London. Very interestingly, Woolf never mentions the word Big Ben in the course of the narrative, but connotations are intentional when she mentions the bell reverberating through the city into the rooms and the consciousness of every character. The literal and metaphorical presence of the architecture operates as a structural and thematic anchor for the novel, probably one of the first instances that illustrates urban architecture as an integral character and catalyst in the workings of the novel, of any novel per se. And in it, interestingly, Woolf makes us not see the clock, but hear it like a conscientious flickering within. It becomes a rather exemplastic application to remember the term. I personally like to look at the reference to the clock in two ways. First, as a literal presence, as a tangible urban marker in the form of a temporal architecture, which is invisibly present only by the sound it creates, underscoring hour by hour progression of the single day that builds up the novel. The chimes periodically punctuate the prose, offering a conspicuous temporal rhythm that structures the reader's experience of Clarissa Dalloway's social calendar and the city's routine, illustrating how public life is synchronized around shared measures of time. In several scenes, Woolf's narration moves towards a sensory register that invites the reader to hear the bells, feel the pressure of time, and sense the city's pulse aligning with the clock. This auditory dimension reinforces the sense that London itself is a living clock, its streets and crowds moving in time with the chimes. And secondly, what I feel, it marks a temporal experience that is a great leveler and functions as a homogenizing agent for London's diverse inhabitants, from aristocrats like Clarissa to working class figures and veterans. Yet, Woolf remains attentive to the disparities that persist beneath the surface. how different social classes experience time, opportunity, and constraints differently. The sound is imagined to spiral across the ether like ringlets, dissolving gradually, leaving an aftertaste inside the head in the form of thoughts and memory, erasing the present and pressing the past squarely into the immediacy of the now. Like the airplane writing Cremo toffee in the sky, up in the sky, seen up by everyone across the city, or like the car backfiring outside the flower shop. The bell reaches everyone in his or her own way. It itself becomes exactly like that luminous halo that Professor Jaidka has mentioned right at the beginning, wrapping one from the beginning to the end. Clarissa, Septimus, Lucrezia, Peter Walsh, Hugh Whitebread, Miss Kilman, everybody hears the sound of the bell at some point or the other, uses it like a conduit for time at various levels, and perceives time in different signification tailored to their own subjectivity, I feel. At a larger scale, the clock, invisibly so to speak, thus literalizes the public-private dichotomy as well. It is a public instrument that nonetheless intrudes upon private memory and introspection, tying Clarissa's intimate reflections to a metropolitan measurability of what we would call personal time. From another point of view, we could also say if Clarissa is the external and Septimus is the internal of the same ego, and it is the sound of time that connects their silent, linkless connection. Finally, the great, rather intimidating physical instrument in the cityscape can also be seen to extend into a national, even imperial temporal framework. Its chimes announce not only the hours, but the centralized authority of the state and the public sphere. To summarize, I perceive the towering yet implied presence of the clock as a thread that connects the metropolitan and the intimate, exactly like Woolf's own oscillation between the external's impact on the internal would take place. From the global to the national to the city to the local to the room and then straight into the psyche. That's how the sound transports us. That's it. Thank you.
Very nice.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. And again, there was a time when we used to talk about city consciousness in literature. And you brought us back into that. And an earlier speaker talked about London being so important in Virginia Woolf in her novels. And I think the senior scholars here would agree that we have a promising bunch of youngsters out here, and the future of literary studies seems to be bright. Okay, so thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And we move on to the next, another bright scholar here, Urvi Sharma. Hi, Urvi. Urvi is an assistant professor in the School of Languages and Culture at Amity University, Punjab. Her research examines how societal power dynamics shape the production and reception of cultural texts, with a particular focus on the intersections of power structures and gender identities. She is the author of The Unsuitable Girl, Critical Reception of Arundhati Roy. Cambridge Scholars, 2024. And incidentally, Urvi is a very active person, an emerging writer and activist in the literary sphere of Chandigarh. I've seen her off and on. She does a great job on the stage as a compere, and as a writer, she's making a mark in this city, beautiful city of ours. So over to you, Urvi. What are you going to talk to us about? Urvi is going to talk about Mrs. Dalloway in the age of artificial intelligence. Again, we are bringing something into the present, something that existed 100 years ago. Okay, Urvi, over to you.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for this fabulous introduction. I'm really humbled and I will try to live up to that. Thank you. I'm really intrigued by all these, wonderful insights that everybody has shared about Mrs. Dalloway. It really, there's so many myriad ways in which we can think about this text. It's so great that we had this discussion. And the subject I really wanted to talk about was how, this text continues to be so timeless even 100 years after its publication. And why it particularly stuck out was because I taught this text last semester, and somehow students were very responsive to Mrs. Dalloway, and also Tristram Shandy, which was quite a coincidence, because I really thought that it is perhaps on account of these fragmented narratives that students could resonate with a text like that. And when I mean, of course, these are very different texts, and Virginia Woolf does something entirely different with Mrs. Dalloway, how she brings in these interior monologues. She gives us these psychological narratives that are far more uh, in depth, intricate. So I was just thinking about, I wanted to talk about how, the world we live in is also very uncannily like Virginia Woolf's London, which is crowded, noisy, full of overlapping thoughts. But ours is not a city crowded with people. Unlike Mrs. Dalloway's London, it is actually a city which is crowded with, data generated specifically for certain audience on the basis of algorithms. So every morning, we step into a digital June day where notifications spark like neurons. There are timelines of consciousness and overlapping, fragments of experience, where we see somebody celebrating their new job or wedding, and that particular image coexists with the image of a child's dismembered body, as in the ongoing genocide in Gaza. And I think this overlapping of emotions, these non-linear timelines, are also very much prescient in Mrs. Dalloway. But this juxtaposition of mediated information on our social media through algorithms often create this sense of ennui or emotional dullness in response to events that demand great moral, ethical, urgent reaction from us as audience. And I think that is where Woolf's writing differs from algorithms. Even though Woolf's writing is fragmented, it does something that neural networks of AI fail to do. It makes us feel, it shows us how to resist that dulling by bringing back human experience and intentionality to the narrative. So I just wanted to go, and there can't be a better way to understand that until we go back to that single June day when Mrs. Dalloway decides to step out to buy flowers. Now, the novel is built on this deceptively simple premise where a woman prepares for a party. And if we look at that frame, when we are scrolling through social media, we look at somebody's picture of buying flowers, we have this perception, mediated perception of somebody who's happy, who's planning a party. But Virginia Woolf takes us on this ride where, Clarissa, when she steps into this morning air, the city emerges as a vast neural networks where, there are different forms of impressions, memories that flicker, and how, she weaves, tethers this consciousness from Dalloway to Septimus in a way that really, as readers, make us experience, ache through those, experiences as we try to process that information, which is very unlike how we receive information through AI generated models. So firstly, I wanted to talk about, how Woolf's narrative in Mrs. Dalloway is very much similar to the neural networks that are used by AI models. So there's a non-linear timeline. There are certain kind of, leaps, like we jump from, the scene where there's some kind of motorbike blast, and, there's an airplane that is writing something in the sky, and suddenly we can see Septimus reacting to that, how he's triggered by that. and there are multiple perspectives, how there are different, reactions to the same stimulus, when Mrs. Dalloway is out in the market. And there's of course this layered interior perspective. But what Woolf's narrative is really doing is it is helping us lay all these narratives bare, so as readers we can process it. So Clarissa, when she hears this motor car backfire, and this shockwave becomes an emotional synapse connecting her consciousness to Septimus, and suddenly we have two minds who completely are undergoing different things, but we can see that sort of similarity in their experiences. We can see how there's this a certain kind of contradiction, but at the same time how Wolf bring these contradictions together into something that they share, a shared memory, a shared grief, a shared disillusionment. And I also wanted to go through this particular quote that Professor Anil Prasad also quoted, where she says, Virginia Woolf writes, she felt very young, at the same time unspeakably aged. Now, this sort of emotional simultaneity is what algorithms fail to capture. It's not just a pattern of thought, but the contradictory texture of being alive. In this way, Woolf is prefiguring a kind of proto AI language architecture where she imbues it with some kind of moral resonance for the reader. And her writing is not a technical method, it's a form of feminist reclamation of interior life, which did not exist at the time when she was writing, which was filled with a lot of privileged public patriarchal voices. And she addresses precisely that, the question of authorship, of who decides, who controls the text, who how the readers mediate the meaning. So if I'm just quoting directly from Introduction to Mrs. Dalloway, which is written by Virginia Woolf. And she says it is difficult, perhaps impossible, for a writer to say anything about his own work. All he has to say has been said as fully and as well as he can in the body of the book itself. If he has failed to make his meaning clear there, it is scarcely likely that he will succeed in some few pages of preface or postscript. And the author's mind has another peculiarity, which is also hostile to introduction. It is as inhospitable to its offspring as the hen sparrow is to hers. Once the young birds can fly, fly they must, and by the time they have fluttered out of the nest, the mother bird has begun to think perhaps of another brood. In the same way, once a book is printed and published, it ceases to be the property of the author. He commits it to the care of the other people, and all his attention is claimed by some new book, which not only thrusts its predecessor from the nest, but has a way of subtly blackening its character in comparison with its own. Now, it's very interesting how she insists that, once a book is published, it ceases to be the property of the author. This also anticipates Foucault's idea where he talks about how author is not a person, but a function, and how it, the culture organizes the very meaning. So in Woolf's hands, in Dalloway, this happens that the author dissolves, the consciousness actually becomes the real author, which is constantly shifting. Barthes would later call this death of author, but Woolf is already practicing it. She refuses to tell us what Mrs. Dalloway means, even though she offers us some scraps of understanding that Mrs. Dalloway was supposed to die towards the end of the text. But she then again deems all these parts of information irrelevant, suggesting that meaning belongs, to the reader. And beneath this also, Woolf is struggling against the inherited structures of the novel. And she talks about how the reason why her narrative looks so different is because she had an idea and there was no house that could accommodate that idea. So she writes this in the introduction: the book grew day by day without any plan at all. So it's a form of, evolution, I believe, where there's a feminist architecture of consciousness that refuses to imitate its literary ancestor. So there's no body that could accommodate those kind of mediation. So she makes up this form. So the form actually follows the idea in that sense. And this also, so I want to bring this, understanding to how we read Mrs. Dalloway today in 2025. So if you think about, how when we read online, things online, there are always these forms of hyperlinks. There's this form of, split screen consciousness. So there are all these devices that are already present in Mrs. Dalloway. Like, one particular incident leads us to another character. Similarly, towards the end of the novel, we see how there are two things that are simultaneously happening, where Septimus is struggling internally and he's overwhelmed by the arrival of Dr. Holmes. And we see how Clarissa's party preparations are ongoing and how these two things, the two scenes unfold almost together. And we are witnessing these two emotional scenes happening in parallel worlds, one leading to death and the other to a social celebration. But we can actually fathom, how these two perceptions are still running concurrently, like a double frame that, reveals their disconnect. So I really feel that while, I mean, these fragmented narratives make so much sense and can teach us so much about processing how we process information in the AI mediated world. It's really interesting how, she writes not just how the mind works, but also like what even is consciousness. She's not even, you know trying to explain consciousness to us. She is really making us think about, consider, what consciousness even means. So when we are wondering about it, it is not even something that can be simulated, because we are interpreting it, we are making meaning, we are attaching meaning to it. So I really feel that on, while we celebrate the 100th year of Mrs. Dalloway, it is not just a modernist masterpiece, but it is also a guide for navigating our own neural networks, digital or human. And Woolf really teaches us that, interiority also becomes a form of resistance. And the mind, it's not just a mechanical thing that is responding to an external stimulus, but it is almost like a luminous city which comes alive with memory, complication, and all sorts of possibilities. So AI may simulate thought out ideas, but Wolf teaches us what it means to think them through, to ache, to feel, and to suffer through this whole process. Thank you.
Thank you, Urvi. Very interesting. And I'm sure you've opened up a lot of avenues for further exploration. In between, when you were talking about it, I was reminded of, cinematic techniques that were used, that were discussed by literary critics at one time. But I appreciate the way you brought in diverse elements and put together Virginia Woolf, Mrs. Dalloway, along with Foucault and Barthes and artificial intelligence. I'm sure we can do a lot more about it. Incidentally, talking about AI and Mrs. Dalloway, we operate through Zoom, and Zoom has that AI thing working in the background. So at the end of every session, it gives us a summary of whatever we have talked about. And sometimes the summary is hilarious. Invariably, it is there are problems, but it is interesting. So what I'll do is I'm going to send that summary to all of you without changing, without editing it, and you can see how artificial intelligence behaves with Mrs. Dalloway, right? So thank you, Urvi, and we move on to the next speaker. Abhyudita, are you there? Abhyudita? Abhyudita, yes.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. I'm there. Good evening.
So Abhyudita teaches in a college in Himachal, and you didn't send me your bio, did you? So why don't you
No.
introduce yourself? Introduce yourself to everyone briefly, and then you can carry.
All
Yeah.
right. Hello, everyone. All my seniors present here. It's such an honor to share the screen with you all. I'm Abhyudita Gautam, and I am an associate professor. I'm working in the Department of Higher Education in the government of Himachal Pradesh, and I'm currently posted in a government college in Dharamshala. And I have been a student of Manju Jaidka ma'am. I've done my master's from PU, and I don't think I would like to introduce myself further. So that's all from my side. And ma'am, can I start?
Yes, please. Please do.
All right. So
He's going
the
to talk about the internal conflicts in Clarissa's life.
Yeah, I'm going to be talking about the internal conflicts in Clarissa's life. And
Yeah.
broadly, I have kind of categorized the conflicts into three categories broadly. So the first one is Clarissa as an individual in her subconscious mind, and Clarissa as a conscious socialite, Mrs. Richard Dalloway. That is the conflict that she faces. The second conflict that I would be talking about is Clarissa's decision to marry Richard and not her longtime lover, Peter Walsh, and also her memories of her friendship with Sally Seaton and her possessiveness for her daughter, Elizabeth. That is the second conflict that I'll be talking about. And thirdly, the conflict between life and death that she witnesses in Septimus, her neighbor. So let me just start with the name, Mrs. Dalloway. You know, the protagonist is Mrs. Dalloway, and it takes the origin from the Latin word Clarissa, which means clear. Clarissa's mind, though her name is Clarissa, which means clear, but her mind is often fogged with the vague ideas and confusing thoughts that we see, in the novel when you read the novel. So she delves into the intricacies of her life, drawing her towards contemplations regarding the decisions that she's made in her past. And she's always wrought with, a lot of mental confusion, a lot of ironies that are going on in her life. And she's not really sure as to what she wants to do in her life, in her present life. So it would be like evaluating the actions and interactions of Mrs. Dalloway under a cognitive function, also like the theory of mind. If we do the psychoanalysis, that Lisa Sunshine, author of Why We Read Fiction, describes it as a ability to explain people's behavior in terms of their thoughts, feelings, beliefs, and desires, and it would help us to understand the character of Clarissa deeply. Although we like to think of a world as a straightforward experience, the brain is constantly utilizing the theory of mind to continue navigating and accommodating to our fluid social environments, and that is what even Clarissa is doing in the novel. And we are doing it for analyzing Clarissa's character. So Clarissa is an individual in her subconscious mind, and Clarissa is a conscious socialite. She's always drawn into these thoughts, exploring her individual and independent personality, which she kept under wraps beneath the mantle of Mrs. Richard Dalloway that she wears in her social life, under obligation to perform the diplomatic duties of maintaining a professional and personal associations, and the parties that were thrown in her house was a display of the web of social relations that they indulged in to sustain themselves in the hierarchical society that they lived in and thrived on. So, according to the individuation theory of Carl Jung, there is a process of self realization, moving from the general collective identity to becoming one's unique, fully realized self. So, Clarissa has been striving to become that unique whole, integrating her conscious self as Mrs. Richard Dalloway and her unconscious self, where the traits of Clarissa, the young unmarried girl, still linger on, bringing forth the raw and untamed side of herself. We get a glimpse of her carefree pre marriage life, which is complete contrast to the class conscious post marriage life that she's currently leading. And her struggle is to keep a balance between the two individual selves that she is, and a slight disturbance would have actually proved to be very, very fatal for her. So, coming back to this theory of mind, the term empirical self is meant as an an encompassing term for the version of the self recognized through three mediums, the material self, the spiritual self, and the social self. So, the material self concerns itself with the body and the psychological ownership or association of tangible objects that are an extension of our being, such as friends, home, place, and possessions. The spiritual self consists of self perceived attitudes, motions, values, motives, and anything along the inner psychological self. And lastly, the social self is defined as the public and social. To say that the self is public was to address the need for an individual's projected image, as we see Clarissa in the novel, where she's presenting herself as Mrs. Dalloway all the time. So this was about the first conflict. The second, I would be coming to the second conflict now, that is Clarissa's decision to marry Richard and not her longtime lover, Peter Walsh, which is a major conflict that she faces. She's communicatively deficient marriage. She has a communicatively deficient marriage with her husband, and it indicates her repressed and suppressed emotions towards life as well. Another aspect that really haunts and disturbs Clarissa is as to why her daughter spends so much time with a history teacher instead of her. So, this kind of a distant relationship with her only daughter is quite contributory. It contributes to her loneliness and isolation in her life. So her present day activities are interwoven with flashbacks to a youthful romance at Burton with Sally and Peter, where she had spent a splendid time, and she's always reminded of that time, which is in contrast to the present time that she's leading her present life, which is, under that socialite mantle of Mrs. Richard Dalloway. So Clarissa had been in a relationship with Walsh, but she chose to move out of the passionate relationship and marry a socially, financially stable, Mr. Richard Dalloway. Through her friendship with Sally, Sally Seaton was her friend. We also find a streak of bisexuality as Clarissa began to read Shakespeare's plays like Othello, quoting a specific line in which she says, "If we were to die there now to be most happy." So, by comparing herself to Othello and Sally to Desdemona, it was a moment of intense joy for her. So, we see that kind of a contradiction in her relationships also. So, now one of the most complex concepts people undergo to achieve unison transcends time and space and yet manifests itself is, of course, love. So, the conflict arises when Peter returns to London from India, and this entire reunion is anxiety induced and more for Peter than Clarissa, because both of them are not able to show the vulnerable side, even though they have been thinking about each other, and they continue to remain very much on each other's minds. Parallel to love is human yearning, which is, carrying that pain also along with it. So the conflict here is, how does the existence of someone continue to manifest in the mind even after they are gone? Now, the last conflict that I'll be talking about briefly is the conflict between life and death, as she witnesses in Septimus, that is her neighbor. So, Virginia Woolf uses this parallel storylines to create a powerful contrast and comparison between the two characters. So, Clarissa and Septimus are very isolated and they feel very lonely. His thoughts and experiences often mirror Clarissa's mind, creating a parallel narrative of internal struggle. And the discourse allows the reader to follow Clarissa exercising the theory of mind. We are exercising it to analyze Clarissa, but she, in the novel, is exercising this theory to attempt to understand her neighbors, her family, and herself. So this theory helps the reader to understand the character, of Clarissa and how she is trying to understand the characters around her in the novel. So, Septimus and Clarissa represent two contrasting paths taken in life. She chooses the one to endure and participate in society, finding beauty in everyday life and relationships, while Septimus, unable to compromise or find meaning, chooses suicide. He escapes. And he chooses suicide to escape the control of doctors and a society that he abhors completely. He doesn't want to be controlled. So he had, of course, joined the army and suffered from shell shock, which is this PTSD that everyone has been talking about earlier also. That is the post-traumatic stress disorder that ultimately resulted in his committing suicide, which Clarissa saw as a very defiant and daring act. At least he could do that, but she's not able to. So she chose a safer side, sacrificing the love for Peter and marrying Richard that would ensure her a socially and financially very stable and secure life, unlike a Septimus here. So she, though superficially manages to regain calm and composure when she sees Septimus dead, and her not going insane in that grave situation is the greatest achievement for her. That is what I feel. And that may be a temporary one also, as the novel ends. So both the characters share similar internal thoughts and feelings, such as an appreciation of beauty, a fear of oppression, and a tendency to quote Shakespeare's Cymbeline, where he says that fear no more the heat of the sun. So their parallel narratives allow Woolf to explore themes of mental illness, social class, and the struggle for personal authenticity in the aftermath of the war. So that's it.
Thank you. Thank you, Abhyudita. I think all the speakers that we have are so interesting, and they've put in so much of work, and they seem to be passionate about what they're doing, about what they're reading.
Yes, ma'am. In fact, I would like to say that, there is a kind of I don't know why I find a kind of a parallel between Anna Karenina and Clarissa. I don't know why I find it so similar. And Septimus was like the train that Anna Karenina sees. So, that kind of invited both of them to commit suicide or, end their lives. So, I don't know. And both were like socially so oppressed.
Great.
Anyway.
Thank you. Thank you, Abhyudita. And we move on. This has been a long session. We still have one more speaker. And
Yes,
after that, we'll go around once again, give a quick 1 minute or minute and a half. And meanwhile, I'm pleased to announce that Professor Raina, ML Raina, has joined us. He's in the background somewhere. Usually he doesn't, he's a little shy and he doesn't like to, reveal himself on the screen. Anyway, ML Raina, sir, good to have you here. And we move on to the next speaker, who is the last speaker. After that, we'll have a quick round summing it up. Naina Day. Naina, you're here? Yeah, great. So this is Naina Day, and she's a widely anthologized critic, translator, and creative writer. She's authored numerous literary and academic articles in noted journals, books, and newspapers. Her books include Macbeth, critical essays, Edward II, critical studies, real and imagined women, the feminist fiction of Virginia Woolf and Faye Weldon, representations of women in George Eliot's fiction, Macbeth, snapshots. My God, I feel so inadequate. Okay, so she has been awarded the Excellence in World Poetry Award 2009 by the International Poets Academy, Chennai, and she was among a team of young Indian writers felicitated jointly by Sahitya Academy and Vishwa Bharati in 2010. She's a functioning member of editorial board of several literary bodies, and currently Eastern Zonal Secretary of the Shakespeare Society of India, New Delhi. She is concept creator of literary and artistic organ Chamunda's Dream. I don't know what that is, perhaps something sounds something special. So as I said, I'm feeling very inadequate reading this bio. But Nena, thank you for joining us. And over to you, Nena. You're going to speak about PTSD in Mrs. Dalloway. Nena Day.
Thank you, ma'am, for that very gracious introduction. And I feel very humbled and privileged to be invited here. And I am very grateful that you have invited me to speak with other very esteemed and distinguished speakers. And of course, today I'm the last speaker, and we are, I think, maybe getting a bit restless because we are
Not
nearing.
at all, not at all. I think everyone's very alert.
It's like, I will just be elaborating on what three of my previous speakers had been mentioning, that is PTSD and life after the war in Mrs. Dalloway. Because Mrs. Dalloway is a book on dissonance, on loneliness, on isolation, both physical and mental, and loss. And the loss is not just the loss of lives during the Great War, but the loss experienced by those left behind. And I will begin with a quote from Ariella Friedman in Dead Men and Modernism. The dissonance of the war, the most difficult problem is it presented was not that life ended, but that life continued. When we begin to read Mrs. Dalloway, we realize that the two main characters belong to those classes positioned at two extremes of the post-war scenario. One, a privileged socialite who is seemingly untouched by the Great War as far as possible from the trenches. The other, a shell-shocked war veteran both disparate, disconnected, yet united in loss, in loneliness. In her essay, Mrs. Dalloway as Trauma Narrative, Virginia Woolf and the Shock of the Asylum, Giovanna Pompili, while calling Mrs. Dalloway a pioneer work in the genre of the female asylum trauma narrative, begins with the case of the shell-shocked soldier Septimus Smith. Septimus has witnessed the violent death of his friend and senior Evans in the Great War. He suffers from hallucinations and paranoia. In Milan, he had proposed marriage to Rizia in the hope of alleviating his war-induced emotional anesthesia. And it is remarkable how Woolf voices her own fear of wartime horrors through Septimus's malady. I'm quoting from the text. When Evans was killed just before the armistice in Italy, Septimus, far from showing any emotion or recognizing that here was an end of friendship, congratulated himself upon feeling very little and very reasonably. The last shells missed him. This is very important. The last shells missed him. He watched them explode with indifference. When peace came, he was in Milan, billeted in the house of an innkeeper with the courtyard, flowers in tubs, little tables in the open, daughters making hats, and to Lucretia, the younger daughter, he became engaged one evening when the panic was on him. He could not feel. Septimus's illness was one that had mentally affected hundreds of nameless others who had been through repetitive shelling, sometimes for days, and witnessed the violent deaths of fellow soldiers. By repetitive shelling, I mean the strain of continual bombardment, continual, not just one bomb and then another after a quarter of an hour, but continual bombardment all the time, pounding and pounding away. And it is and the illness that overcomes these that had overcome these soldiers was an illness that society termed cowardice or failed to realize or acknowledge. Though it is notable that the psychological trauma due to shell shock and battle fatigue that affected Vietnam War veterans later on led to the formal introduction of a new terminology, post-traumatic stress disorder (PTSD), mentioned by three of my previous speakers in 1980, with the publication of the third edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. This type of condition was likely to be common in sufferers of or first-hand witnesses to violence and unspeakable horrors, and resulted in anxiety, manic depression, insomnia, nightmares, flashbacks, and non-communication, among other extreme symptoms. Nowadays, you are also associating PTSD with victims of, marital abuse or victims or accident victims. As early as 1915, army hospitals became inundated with soldiers requiring treatment for wounded minds, tremors, blurred vision, and fits, taking the military establishment entirely by surprise. Approximately 80,000 British soldiers were treated for shell shock over the course of the war. Woolf is therefore deliberate and ironical when she states that it was by enrolling himself for the war that Septimus instantly developed manliness in the eyes of Mr. Brewer. But underneath the veneer of the war-ravaged hero, Septimus returns as a complete mental wreck. It is then that he finds refuge in the feminine pastoral world of Rizia, a world oblivious to the chaos of the trenches. However, marriage fails to cure Septimus. We all know that. He increasingly sees visions and hears the singing of his dead friend Evans, and finally goes completely mad. What grips us is not just the way Woolf portrays Septimus sinking into madness, but how she implicitly refers to the rest homes through Septimus's terror and consequent suicide. While referring to shell-shocked soldiers as war's psychiatric casualties. Doctors Mark Antoine Kroc and Louis Kroc, in their paper From Shell Shock and War Neurosis to Post-Traumatic Stress Disorder, A History of Psychotraumatology, refer to a report by the well-known German psychiatrist Robert Goop in 1917, which gave a vivid description of the reality that undermined conventional concepts of war heroism. And Goop gives an account that the big artillery battles of December 1914 began to fill the hospitals with a large number of unscathed soldiers and officers presented with mental disturbances. And the number began to constantly increase. And at first they were admitted with the ordinary soldiers, the maimed and wounded soldiers, but gradually they had to open special psychiatric hospitals. The main causes were fright and anxiety brought about by the explosion of enemy shells and mines and seeing maimed or dead comrades. The resulting symptoms were states of sudden muteness, deafness, general tremor, inability to stand or walk, episodes of loss of consciousness and convulsions. And Woolf may have, when we read Mrs. Dalloway, we feel in this kind of a background study that Woolf may have elided deliberately the real cause behind Septimus's terror of Bradshaw's treatment, simply calling it the rest cure, when the reality was perhaps severe means of treating soldiers with stress disorders. Kroc and Kroc records that among the many treatment applied to stress disorders, one was much used during World War I and scarcely at all during World War II, the application of electrical current, also called Faradayization. This was probably because motor symptoms such as tremor, paralysis, contractions, limping, or fixed postures were common during the First World War and rare in the Second World War. Faradayization was criticized in post-war Austria. Wagner Jurek, a professor of psychiatry in Vienna who was awarded a Nobel Prize in 1928, was even accused of excessive cruelty in the administration of this treatment and had to appear before an investigating committee in which Sigmund Freud had the more enviable role of testifying as an expert. In her introduction to the 2003 Wordsworth edition of Mrs. Dalloway titled Mrs. Dalloway and the Feminist Revision of Male Modernism, Miriam Pawlowski shows how social conditioning had prevented the medical fraternity from effectively treating trauma patients like Septimus, and Woolf's unforgiving stance regarding doctors like Holmes and Bradshaw. However, to read Mrs. Dalloway merely as trauma narrative or a narrative of the sexually repressed would be an incomplete analysis of the novel, for both Clarissa and Septimus represent those who cannot or would not fit in. Now, incidentally, when we talk of PTSD today, you have to remember that Clarissa also underwent loss. That is the loss of her sister Sylvia, who died in an accident, and Rizia also undergoes loss, that is the loss of her husband. Both losses are also through violence, mutilation. When we talk of violence, we talk of the mutilation of the body. Now, we do not, you get to know that Rizia also faces a shock. She goes into a kind of delirium. She begins to daydream. Later on, we hear nothing more of her. She becomes one of the faceless widows after the war. Both Clarissa and Septimus have been thrust by social conditioning into roles they were not meant for. Clarissa for the life of a married socialite, Septimus for a life of military combat. Seemingly private and public expectations work hand in hand to convert the misfits of society as they have in the case of Lady Bradshaw. Those who, like Septimus, refuse to conform, perish, That is the climax of the novel, which leaves us with the question, has Woolf left the novel open-ended or has it ended in anticlimax? Is it that Septimus's desire to communicate the incommunicable is finally achieved by his death, or was his incommunicable incoherence a powerful tool for communicating the stark truth that society and the medical fraternity were ill-equipped to deal with his malady and could offer nothing but ostracism and seclusion, worsening his condition instead of compassion? Thank you so much.
Thank you, Naina. Thank you. You were the last speaker, but well, you kept us all riveted. Huh? So we're talking about PTSD, which was mentioned earlier, but then you went into greater depth. Thank you for that. In this session, we've had several different viewpoints, beginning with Harish Trivedi's personal encounter with Mrs. Dalloway and Virginia Woolf, and with this subject and how he did his PhD on it. Then we went on to an ecological reading of Mrs. Dalloway. Anil Prasad spoke about that. And Tara Khatak talked about Mrs. Dalloway in the post-conflict context. Ritu Shri spoke of mental health, a contemporary reading of Mrs. Dalloway. Sangeeta Sanyal talked about the presence of Big Ben. Purvi brought in a new topic, Mrs. Dalloway in the age of artificial intelligence. Abhyudita on internal conflicts in Clarissa. And Nena Day, whom you've just heard, on PTSD and life after the war in Mrs. Dalloway. So we have these different perspectives on Mrs. Dalloway, and this has been a very long session, but we'll go around once quickly. I'm wondering if you'd like to add something to it, maybe a short observation or whatever you'd like to say in maybe a minute or so, beginning with Harish Trivedi.
Yes, Manju, it was riveting and it was very educative and illuminating. Very impressive indeed, all the papers. I'd say just one thing. This is time not for two, but one. There is a tendency on our parts to read the classics as if they were infallible, as if the authors did everything right. Which is right at a certain age, at a certain stage of one's evolution. But at the same time, one has to stand outside the charmed circle. And I like the fact that right at the end, Nana, I think it was, who asked a question about whether Mrs. Dalloway actually delivers at the end, or does it evade and fail in how Septimus is treated in the novel, not only by the doctors, but by Woolf. I found that very refreshing. Thank you.
Thank you, Harish. You're right. Even the writers whom we place on a pedestal, they all have feet of clay, and we as critics need to be aware of that. Professor Prasad, would you like to add something? Unmute, please.
Yes, thank you. All the presentations were really very educative. I learnt a lot. I just would like to add about PTSD. The people who talked about PTSD, it is related to what I presented, which is called urban modernism, in which the big cities, they tell upon the health of characters. But I also would like to add that two more novels are important. I remember Professor Dhar's novel was discussed, in which there was a character, a soldier, who was suffering from trauma. And there is another person, Leslie Marmon Silko, whose novel Ceremony, that is the post-World War II novel, in which the character Tayo is suffering from PTSD, but he is restored to health, and because of storytelling and all this. So it's very interesting, and there are lots of things to say about city and the fragmentation and stream of consciousness. But I am very happy that this session, though long, yet very refreshing, and we learned a lot. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Prasad. Would anybody else like to add to that? Any of the speakers? And we have Professor Raina now on the screen. Thank you for joining us, Professor Raina. Good to see you here. And Professor Raina, incidentally, has offered to do a full lecture on Mrs. Dalloway whenever it's convenient. Yes, anybody else who would like to add something to the discussion? Professor Raina, would you like to say something now? Unmute, please. Unmute.
I said I'll reserve it for my lecture sometime.
Wonderful. Just give us a date, huh? And everyone's very happy to hear that. Yeah.
Right now, I'm so sleepy, I can't give you a date. So, right. I'll let everybody know when I'm ready.
Okay, great. You know what I like is that all these scholars who joined us here today, who have spoken up, they haven't done it for any kind of professional reasons. It's only because they're so passionate about literature, passionate about the text that we are discussing. The others who are not on the screen, if you'd like to join the discussion, please switch on your videos for the next couple of minutes that we are here. Switch on your video so that everyone can see you. And I must, there are a few points that I have to put before you. The first is that Ishtiaq is the one who does the posters for us. Ishtiaq, if you're there, just switch on your video. Ishtiaq does the posters for us, and he can explain what today's poster is all about, if he's still there and if he would like to. Thank you, Ishtiaq, for doing this for us every time. Here he is, Ishtiaq, yeah. So he is the, yeah. Would you like to explain the poster? Because he did explain it to me.
Yeah, it was nothing, I mean, nothing too deep, but I just put the waves to represent the stream of consciousness. And then I had two portraits, one of Mrs. Dalloway and one of herself.
Cover.
So yeah, the thing, that's all.
Great, thank you. Then another point, something that struck me while the session was going on was that, you know, you've done some work on this and you made a presentation. Do you want to stop at that, or do you want to put something in writing? You want to put it in the form of a monograph, or would you like that? Thinking of that also. So just get back to me. You can write to me and we can discuss. And well, with that, we need to wind up today's session. The other people who are in the background are not coming onto the screen, but I'd like to thank them, and I'd like to thank Harish Trivedi, and Roshan has come onto the screen. Thank you, Roshan. So I think it's been a great session.